So, welcome to the very first episode of the Dongfang Hour podcast, which is a podcast that specifically discusses Chinese aerospace and technology. I'm Jean Deville. I'm the founder and writer at China Aerospace blog, usually based in Shanghai, although somewhat between Paris and Toulouse currently. And as always, I'm joined by Blaine Curcio.
I'm Blaine Curcio, founder of Hong Kong-based Orbital Gateway Consulting and affiliate consultant at Euroconsult. And for the moment, I am very much based in Hong Kong.
Excellent. Great. Perhaps just to say a few words about the structure of this podcast, since this is the very first podcast, we will probably give a short introduction at the beginning of what this podcast is all about, what is its ambition. After that, we will move on to the core of the topic, which is what sets the Chinese space industry apart, what are the differences, what are also potentially the similarities. And after that, we will wrap this up by discussing why we find this industry in China so fascinating. Perhaps for those of you who are in a hurry, we'll put some links and timestamps in the description below so you can fast forward directly to the part that you would like to watch. And apart from that, let's get started. So take a seat and let's roll the intro.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to welcome you aboard the Dongfang Hour. Please make sure your seatbelt is securely fastened. Thank you.
女士们、先生们，预计空中飞行时间2小时15分钟，我们预计在当地时间下午6点25分左右到达。
So Blaine, perhaps for starters, would you like to give our viewers an idea of how this podcast took shape and what it's all about?
Sure, Sean, I'd be happy to. I feel kind of like a broken record saying this, but 2020 has been a crazy, weird, unusual year. A lot of topics are coming front and center in a way that they have not come before, and two such topics are China and space. And both Jean and I have been sitting at different parts of the intersection of China and space for several years, and we feel that now is the perfect time to start having a dialogue about the intersection of these two topics, and we think that we are decent people to start having this conversation. So we're happy to bring the conversation to listeners and the broader audience, broader public.
And I'd say more generally, one of the main goals of the Dongfang Hour is to bring a little bit more open discussion on Chinese space, at least that discussion that's not behind closed doors, comparatively to Europe and especially the US. And what I mean by this is, well, in the US, we've seen multiple CEOs of space companies directly interact with space fans, with people on social media, on Twitter, on YouTube, and heck, even the administrator of NASA. So that's extremely impressive. I think that's a way also to get the public more supportive of space policies. And I think that if this could, if you could add a little bit of this to the Chinese space industry, it would definitely make the whole thing for us space fans more enjoyable for sure. So now let's move on to the core of our discussion today, which is what sets China apart. If I was to start, probably one of the first things that would come to mind is policy on my side. One thing that makes China's space program extremely remarkable is its consistency and its perseverance. So what I mean by this is that the Chinese have often had a lot of long-term goals. It can be 5 years, it can be 10 years, it can be even over decades. And what is also interesting is they tend to stick to these plans, which is even all the more remarkable for us from Europe and from the US, where, well, because in our political systems, administrations tend to change every now and then, every 4, 5, 6 years. This probably is ingredients for less stable support for space programs, whereas in China you have the head of state and its cabinet usually in place for a period of 10 years, and currently probably more than 10 years. So that's something that definitely helps to have continuous support for their space program. And so that's that. But of course, I don't think we can put entirely this continuity of the Chinese space planning on that. There's also, if we think of a program like Project 921, which is the crewed space flight program of China, which has a time span over 3 decades, It dates back to the early 1990s, and we've seen all the steps of their planning, where they were at first setting up the Shenzhou spacecraft, sending taikonauts to space starting from 2003, and then doing some EVA, sending experimental space stations up in the air, and also practicing space rendezvous docking. And today we are expecting to see the Chinese, a fully fledged Chinese space permanent space station in space before 2025. So all this planning that was done over the past 30 years is very impressive, and I think that's one interesting that you have in Chinese policymaking, and that's actually not specific to space. I mean, you see that in general in other industries. You also have what the Chinese call the 5-year plans, though. So it's this sort of general planning they do every 5 years, and where they give the general directions in every industry vertical. And so they do this for space. You have the space white papers. You have another long-term plan that I can think of is, for example, from CASC, they published in 2017. What they called the 2045 roadmap. So basically it gives the vision that CASC has of space over the next 30 years, and also describing the different milestones in the 2020s, 2030s, although this description was definitely very general. So anyway, I think that's quite interesting of Chinese space policy, as well as the fact that it's often done in 2 steps. So basically you have 5-year planning, space white paper, all these papers which are central government papers, which are in general, as I mentioned, more general. They're not necessarily extremely descriptive and detailed of what should be done. And then you have lower level government, so basically local governments, state-owned companies that make an interpretation of these texts and then implement them locally. So this 2-step process is probably there are probably advantages and disadvantages to it, but I think it's fair to say that this is pretty unique in the Chinese space way of doing things compared to other space powers, I guess.
Yeah, so that's there's a lot of interesting insights to unpack there and to dig into. So just a couple of points that I think are worth highlighting from what you just mentioned. Something we'll come back to later is this idea that the state-owned enterprises are also planning in very long time horizons. So you have, as Jean mentioned, the government at its highest level is planning in very long time horizons, and then the CNSA and the space program is also planning in long time horizons, and that allows companies such as CASC to also plan in very long time horizons. And again, later on, we'll come back to this when contrasting it with the way that private companies need to plan relative to these SOEs. But I do think it's a very important point, this idea that because the policymakers are doing these fairly long-term plans, it allows the sort of incumbents that are implicitly an extension of the state to some extent to have equally long-term plans, as it were. And then, yeah, I think it's an interesting point about this 2-step approach, and thinking about these sort of these more specific, smaller scale areas where the government would come in sort of in between 5-year plans and make decisions that would be unlocking parts of the industry. I think that's an important distinction of policy as well in China. So this way that the government makes policies to nudge the industry in a certain direction. So I think one interesting comparison we could look at is this recent US and China have both been emphasizing satellite broadband in different ways. So the US, the FCC made their rural fund of something like $16 billion US, and then you had a bunch of companies make applications to the FCC for constellations which, if they were to be launched, could potentially be eligible for some of the $16 billion US in funding. That was, I believe, 16 billion. You don't quote me on that exact figure, but some order of magnitude. And this is sort of how the U.S. has tried to encourage satellite broadband. Conversely, in China, we saw 6 weeks ago now, the National Development and Reform Commission, the NDRC, they added satellite broadband to their list of new infrastructures. And they didn't specifically mention LEO, although I guess neither did the FCC in the US. It was just satellite broadband. But anyway, you had the NDRC add it to their list. And then after that, you saw all of these different companies. So far, I've seen, I think, 4 or possibly 5 in about 6 weeks, make fairly significant announcements whereby they do something, whether it's raise some funding or release some new products or do some other thing, and then say within the press release that announces this, and the NDRC recently added satellite broadband to the list of new infrastructures, and that's sort of why we're doing this. So I guess this distinction in just sort of how the government uses policy to nudge the market to do things that it sort of wants to encourage. So yeah, I think that's an interesting distinction within policy, and I think second, sort of related to another of the points that Jean just brought up, and kind of taking us into our next topic is this sort of the role of central government versus local authorities. So if we think about in the West, it's interesting. We think of the Chinese central government as being this huge force, which it is. The central government of China is enormous. But if you look at the percentage of government spending in the West compared to China, and we split it between central and local or state governments, the Chinese government is actually much more state and local heavy. So 70-ish% of Chinese government spending is spent by state and local local governments, as opposed to the central government. Whereas in the West, it's about 70% central government. Now, the reason for this in China is because partly just the central and the state and municipal governments are enormous. Just so many bureaucrats at so many different levels. But what that means is that the local and state level governments are rather more important, relatively speaking, than the central government in a lot of ways. And this extends to space. So in the context of space, you have a lot of space companies in China that have selected a province or a city, usually a province or a city, and made some agreement or gotten some funding from that province or city, or gotten some free land or other sort of incentives that have been really instrumental in allowing the company to set up there and to expand. And this exists in the West also, certainly. I mean, there's the Space Coast in Florida. I believe the Florida government has incentivized that in some way. And there's a few other instances of that. But I think in China, the sort of state and local level governments are much more important. And you see this also in the number of state and city government venture capital funds that are investing in new space companies. You see it in things like, I recall, as I believe, Jean, I think you were there as well, the China Space Day in 2019 in Changsha. And the reason that it was brought to Changsha partly is because the governor of Changsha, the governor of Hunan province, of which Changsha is the capital, he was a former former head of CASC, and a former head, very high-level person within the CNSA. I think both. We can double-check that. But anyway, a guy called Shu Dazhe, and he really wanted to bring this conference to Hunan, and he wanted to bring lots of space industry to Hunan. And as a provincial governor, he had a fair bit of clout to do this. So I think this is another important sort of policy-related difference between China and the West, is this this state versus the sort of central government versus the sort of local and provincial government, and the different roles that they play. Whereby in China, the local and the provincial government is a lot more important.
Blaine, I can definitely concur on what you're saying. I mean, here in Europe, we have central government help for local companies. We have ESA, for example, that has these incubator initiatives. You also have that on a national level. And we also have local ecosystems which are helping startups here, for example, in Toulouse. But we definitely have nothing on the scale of what the Chinese are doing on a local level. For example, Hunan Province or Hubei. It's just, I mean, the adjective that comes to mind is just massive. It's just massive amount of work, and definitely there is this huge gap between at least the West, at least Europe, and China regarding what is done on a local level. And in general, and this sort of is a transition to my next point, I think in all countries in space, the state plays a very important role for many reasons, for historical reasons, for example, because Well, because space has always been closely linked to sovereignty, to the fact that there are many military applications in space, and as well as the fact that for a rather big part of the 20th century, well, space was rather a new environment and needed the state to pioneer this new frontier before it was demonstrated that it was commercially viable. And starting from then, we had an entrance of a significant amount of private capital. We also had privatizations. We've also had a very big wave of commercialization of a lot of space activities. So there's been definitely a lot of change regarding this over the past decades. And excuse the sound of rain that you may have overhead. It is definitely a very rainy day here in France, but just bear with me. So anyway, in recent years, a lot of commercialization, privatization for parts of the space industry in the world, but in China, actually, not so much. I mean, things haven't changed that much in China. Today, the space industry in China, you can basically sum it up to more or less to two state-owned enterprises, which are CASC and CASIC. And if you limit yourself to the civil space program, basically it's only CASC. And the sole purpose of CASC essentially is to serve the government needs regarding space. So may that be Earth observation, telecoms, launches, navigation, whatever. So there is, I mean, from a quantitative point of view, very little that is done from a commercial point of view, although that is changing, and you also have a little bit of a private sector gaining momentum since 2014. So I think that's definitely very remarkable of the very strong hold that the state, that the central government still has on space, on the space industry in China compared to other countries.
Just a quick loop back to one last point, just I guess a thought exercise on the role of local governments. It's like with X-Space, the Hubei government, basically, I mean, it's Sanjiang, it's sort of, that's essentially like $200 million of like, if not local government funds. There's a fair amount of, I mean, could you imagine like the Toulouse government spending, a couple $100 million to support a rocket company in Toulouse that's a private commercial company? It's a lot of money. I can't imagine a U.S. state doing that. There's no way. 200. That's a crazy amount of money. That's a lot of money for yeah. But yeah. So going back to your point about this really dominating role of the state and of CASC, and just for our listeners, and I know it's the first episode and you will hear CASC a lot, but for those of us who are CASC is the spelling of CASC, and then CASIC is CASIC. So you may find that in the show notes, but it's important. Those are two important acronyms to remember in the Chinese space industry. And to your point about, again, the dominance of this state-owned apparatus and just the state in general, I think there's an important distinction when considering China and the U.S. specifically, in the sense that in the U.S. You have all these big industrial companies, and they are predominantly commercial, publicly traded companies. You have Boeing and Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman and all of these, and SpaceX, and then you have NASA. And NASA is a very big organization that has many rocket scientists, and they build a lot of their own stuff, and they have a huge budget, and they're able to dish out contracts to different organizations, and they themselves have a lot of power also. And importantly, NASA's not a commercial company. It's a pretty independent thing. In China, you have the CNSA, which is sort of the Chinese equivalent of NASA. It is the China National Space Administration, and they are much smaller. They don't actually build things. They don't actually really give out contracts per se, except for very large, high-level contracts, mostly to CASC. But they don't really have as much of a mandate to work with commercial companies, nor do they have as much of the resources to do it. NASA has a lot of people who are going out and trying to find innovative American space companies that are doing things that NASA wants anyway, like NASA wants specific technologies, and that NASA can use their budget to help support, while again getting what NASA wants for probably less money than what it would have otherwise cost. So you have this big difference in the U.S. versus China, where in China the CNSA does not have such a mandate. And so what you end up having happen is that the CNSA will award this big contract to CASC. And CASC, as the main contractor, they are a very big company with many different subsidiaries that do many different things. So most likely, if you get a huge contract given to CASC to build, a dozen Earth observation satellites, CASC could probably make, let's say, 70, 80, 90% of those satellites and of the launch and all of it internally. They are a very big company that can do many things. And so they don't really have any incentive. Well, so first of all, they can do most of this internally. They don't really need to subcontract things. And even if they do want to subcontract things, they don't really have an incentive to subcontract them. This would be like if NASA was saying, okay, we're going to give all of our big contracts to Boeing, and then we're going to let Boeing subcontract them to whomever Boeing wants to subcontract them to. And NASA will play no role in this. So I think when we think about sort of the relationship that the state has with private enterprise and the ability that the state has to help nurture private enterprise, I think the incentive structure in China is not as accommodating for commercial companies, because you have a relatively a state space program whose resources are more predominantly controlled at the end of the day by a couple of very large companies, or really just one very large company. And just to kind of add to this, I mean, one thing that we often hear in the space industry in China when I speak with different friends of mine that work for commercial companies or just analysts or whomever, there's this kind of unofficial saying that in China, CASC is space and space is CASC. And CASC, they have the full name of CASC is China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, and there are two short names for CASC, and the first one is like sort of like China Aerospace Science Technology, but the second one, 中国航天, it literally just means China Aerospace. So it's just they are, their short name is just China Aerospace. I remember seeing this photo of a big CASC project in Egypt that I'm sure we will talk about on a later episode of this big space city being built outside of Cairo. And there's these big tanks that are filled with, I guess, maybe rocket fuel, I don't know, big tanks. And they just have 中国航天, just the China Aerospace and CASC, and because CASC is space and space is CASC. So that I would say if I'm trying to think of what is the biggest difference in terms of the role the state plays, I think it's that sort of incentive structure and how they can or cannot support commercial entities, and just the extent to which CASC does control quite a lot of resources in the sector.
And perhaps to build up on the differences between CNSA and NASA, NASA is this huge agency that does a lot of fundamental research, which is definitely not in the scope of CNSA. CNSA is more of this, I'd say, this interface with international space. And what you also notice is that NASA historically was actually called NACA, the National Advisory Council for Aeronautics. And so it does a lot also in aviation, and we can easily think of a great number of X-planes that were done by NASA. So NASA also has activities in many industries that are just beyond the narrow scope of space. So anyway, just to build up on the fact that NASA is much bigger than CNSA. And to move on, maybe another major difference that I would see between China and other countries is the fact that China is probably, among all the top space powers, the least connected space power to its other space partners, and for a wide variety of reasons. Today, as mentioned just now, business in China is basically geared, space business, at answering the needs of the central government regarding, as I mentioned earlier, launch, Earth observation, etc. And very little deals are actually done internationally. There are some, but most of them are actually, I guess probably all of them are B2G deals, and usually with countries that are either close allies of China or in China's sphere of influence, or perhaps, among Belt and Road countries or African countries, which is a continent in which China invests a lot. There's Pakistan, there's Venezuela, there's also some Southeastern Asian countries. You have also multiple African countries. You mentioned Egypt just now. And there are many reasons why China is rather isolated on the international scene in space. One of the main reasons, I guess, would be ITAR, which is a US regulation that basically deprives China from sourcing any major space subcomponent or subsystem from the US, and consequently from a wide number of space partners of the US. So that's one of the main reasons. Also, this regulation prohibits basically China launching any U.S. satellite or any satellite with U.S. components. So that's a very big number of international satellites as well. So that's probably the first reason. And I guess there's also the fact that there is very strong competition from foreign competitors on international markets. You have a wide number of very well-established foreign companies from Europe, from North America, from Japan, from Russia, from other space countries, which have been doing this for a very long time, and which is, I think it's fair to say that these companies, very well-established companies, for the time being have, the latest cutting-edge technology that there is to offer in space. Things, of course, are changing recently. So, I mean, there are new trends of Chinese putting effort into commercializing their space industry. And as mentioned before, we also have a rise of a number of private startups ever since 2014, probably a little bit before as well, ever since the Chinese central government has been looking more favorably at private capital and private companies supporting the development of this industry.
Yeah, and I mean, I think to that point, China has definitely, I mean, they've expanded their influence internationally quite a lot over the last, say, 5 or 10 years in the context of space. But one of the reasons that they are one of the least international is because they are still a relatively new entrant. And I think about, first of all, I guess we can sometimes take for granted like how unbelievably turnkey and specialized some of these space solutions are. So a couple of examples, like I remember I was doing a project for a client in the Middle East a couple of years ago, and we were looking at another deal that they had done with a European aerospace European aerospace giant, where part of the deal was that the European aerospace giant was going to take a bunch of executives from this country's aerospace industry and bring them to that country and do some sort of executive MBA kind of thing, and have all this sort of joint training and really just so much kind of soft power kind of, you need to, in order to be a leading space power, you need to have a lot of leading universities in different areas. You need to have an international kind of academic network. So for example, I mean, countries like the US or like France or like the UK, a lot of foreign academics are coming to the universities in these countries and doing leading research. And that ends up, if those foreign academics go back to their home countries and work with their space program, that ends up making those space programs a bit more connected to Western space programs. I mean, that's just sort of how it has been in the past, because it takes time to really build up those kind of infrastructures, which the US and many Western European countries have done. This gets kind of interesting, though, because when you look at China today, you see an increased number of students from South Asia or from Southeast Asia or from Sub-Saharan Africa or other places going to universities like Beihang or like even less renowned universities within China. But Beihang being the Beijing Academy of Aeronautics and anyway,
I'll build on that. I'll just answer this.
Go ahead.
Right now. Yeah. So Beihang is actually Beijing Hangkong Hangtian Daxue, so Beijing University of Aeronautics and Astronautics. Actually, its old name was BUAA, and they figured out that Beihang would probably be a more international friendly name than just 4 letters. And I would definitely confirm what you're saying, because I actually did a back when I was studying engineering, I did a research internship in Beihang. And I would definitely confirm that a great number, I'd say the majority of exchange students that were there were from the Indo-Pacific subcontinent, a lot of Africans as well, and actually not that many people from Western Europe or from the United States. And those that were there, most of them was for this language program that Beihang had. At least that was my impression during those 6 months there.
Okay.
So, but yeah, I definitely confirmed this trend for sure.
And just one other little anecdote about Beihang, and then I think you want to talk about the space program of China. But with Beihang, I was at a conference in Beijing in December of 2018, I think. So, and it was. It was a fairly Chinese con. I mean, all of the panels were in Mandarin. It was all 97% of the attendees were Chinese. I was there with Euroconsults, with a couple of people from Europe, and I noticed there were a fair number of pretty young Latin Americans in the room, and I was thinking, oh, okay, that's interesting. Just must maybe like some program from Venezuela or something. And after the conference, I went up and spoke with them. Just to kind of see what they were up to. And they're like, oh yeah, we're students from Beihang. They asked us to come here today just, because it was kind of an activity. I'm like, okay. So that explains the 3% of the international was students from Beihang. So yeah, I guess there are Latin Americans at Beihang. There are not so many Latin American people that actually want to come to these kind of conferences, perhaps, at that time. Hence having to send the Beihang students.
I was actually asked to do that once or twice when there were perhaps visits from French or European delegations. Anyway, very nice campus, Beihang. They had a lot of facilities built up for the Beijing Olympics in 2008. So.
Is it in Zhongguancun, or is that elsewhere in town, Beihang?
It's in that area.
Okay.
It's in that high tech area, Fourth Ring. It's quite a nice campus, definitely.
It's a good spot.
And maybe just not to get too much off topic on Beihang, the next point for me, next difference between Chinese space and international space, and actually this one would be more of a similarity, is the very ambitious space program that the Chinese have. That is, in my opinion, at least on par with Europe. Of course, it depends on what you're looking at. And although still perhaps lagging behind what the US space program is currently. And you have a very ambitious space program because it includes exploration of the moon, of Mars. There's a lot of crewed space flight. There's also space sciences. There's deep space exploration. There's astrophysics. Anyway, I have a feeling with the Chinese space program, the entire spectrum is covered, similar to what other space powers are doing. And in terms of cooperation, I guess this is also sort of a half difference, half similarity. Well, you have the Chinese definitely cooperate a lot less, at least not on the scale of what, for example, what Europe is doing with the US. Europe and a lot of European companies are definitely on board a lot of NASA programs. And although it is definitely a lot more than any commercial relationship that the Chinese space industry can have with international counterparts. So you have, for example, a lot of can have international payloads on the different Chang'e moon missions and things like that. And I think the extra cooperation that you have regarding the Chinese space program with other countries is also due to the fact that, well, apart from the US and I guess Russia, most other space powers on this planet so Europe, Japan, etc., have given up on having, a 100% domestic, full-fledged space exploration program, at least crewed space exploration program. So Europe, for example, has given up on having its own independent, I'd say, for example, space shuttle or spacecraft that would go into space and that would be crewed. And so in general, it would go through cooperation with NASA. It would be in cooperation with other countries. And I guess that with the ambitious space program that China has, China also is definitely a very good candidate for cooperation for these nations and countries, and like Europe and Japan that have got into the habit of inserting themselves in these programs rather than starting these programs on their own. Of course, I'm basically talking mostly about crewed spaceflight. So I guess that's one of the big differences for me, and similarities, the Chinese space program.
So just a thought on that. I wonder to what extent, and this is to what extent is China's space program, as we mentioned a moment ago, relatively less internationalized because of the sort of desire by China to be rather self-sufficient, let's say, technologically self-sufficient. So, for example, with Europe, I suppose Europe says we maybe don't have the greatest geography to have a large spaceport in Europe, so we're going to build one on French Guiana, which is a bit of, yes, it's Europe administratively, but it's still. I guess China would, or I guess so China Europe, they use French Guiana, or they use Baikonur, I suppose, is the other option. There's no real European spaceport for large launch, is there, other than French Guiana, right?
Yeah, on continental Europe. No.
Right. So this would be a little bit. I mean, could you imagine China having like their only spaceport for large launch being like very, very, very far from China? I don't know. I just feel like the extent to which China has this sort of this desire to be self-sufficient, it makes it less easy for them to say we will cooperate with other countries for very big projects. I guess maybe the ISS is an example where I think
I would agree with that. And when you look at the scope of cooperation, often is, we, China, have built this entire space station, or this spacecraft, and you can put on your payloads, if you like, some scientific experiments. And it is not to the point for example, what the US and Europe are doing in cooperation. It's not like for the Chinese space station, for example, is, space station, the Chinese space station is basically consists of 3 modules, Tianmeng, for example, and you don't see the Chinese saying we will build Tianmeng, and Europe, you will build the second module, and maybe a third country will build the third module. I think for the central systems, there is definitely this criteria of self-sufficiency, and cooperation is more for secondary stuff, so to speak, such as payloads.
I guess one thing that might be worth looking into at a later point is like, to what extent is GPS, for example, 100% made in America parts, or are there European parts in the GPS satellites, or Galileo maybe for in terms of other? But anyway, that's another discussion for another time. So I guess going into the last area, and I promised our listeners at the very beginning that we would come back to this mindset of the big SOEs being very long-term oriented compared with the private companies having to be much more short-term oriented. And I think this is something that's quite different in China compared to the West, that not only are private companies much rather more short-term oriented, but also venture capitalists and investors more generally are more short-term oriented, and they're also a bit nimbler in some instances. And I think the reason for this is that companies in China are used to, private companies in China are used to working in a market where the regulations are uncertain, and where there's a big incumbent that if you ever get to be a certain size, or if you ever do something that's particularly annoying for that incumbent, your days could be numbered for very arbitrary reasons in a very kind of unpredictable way. And so you have a situation where nobody wants to make very big long-term decisions. This is exacerbated by, again, the lack of clarity in regulations. For example, if you want to build a large rocket company that can do big rockets, at the moment, in theory, that might be within 5 or 10 years that might become feasible in China from a regulatory perspective, but it also might not. And there's absolutely no guarantee that you could, if you succeeded in building the rocket, there's no guarantee you could actually launch the. In the U.S., I think with SpaceX, for example, implicit with Musk trying to build that rocket is that if he built a functioning rocket that was going to be able to get NASA to space, or get the Air Force or the military to space for cheaper, implicit was that it would get used. that there's going to the U.S. Air Force, if Musk comes in and says I will launch this reliably at half the price, implicit is that someone will get use of this for half the price in a market-based sort of setting where it's kind of the best product can win. If he does in fact come to market with something that is half the price for the same service reliably, then it should theoretically win. In China, there is absolutely no such illusion that would be a guarantee, and this is why you have a lot of companies, a lot of startups that are having to focus on smaller parts of the market that are less politically sensitive or less technologically sensitive. They're having to focus on business models that are that require less very long-term investment and are able to generate revenues more quickly and generate growth more quickly. And I think this is a big difference, not only to space companies in the West and also to venture capitalists in the West that I think have longer time horizons, but also compared to, again, the SOEs in China, where you have a cask that is, they're looking at the 5 and the 10-year plans, and they're looking at what does the Chinese government want to do on the moon in 2040, and they're saying we're probably going to be a big part of that in some way or another. These commercial companies are just trying to throw darts at a board and figure out what part of the industry is most likely to get deregulated or otherwise be sort of politically palatable to address in the near future. And that's a tough spot to put private companies into. And I think that has caused private companies in China to be a lot more collaborative. And it's a very different feeling compared to the West. And so one last example I'll give, and then I think we're about heading into the conclusion here, is I was at a conference in Wuhan a couple of years ago, and I went to a dinner after this conference, and the dinner was hosted by Xspace, which is this, it's the big, nominally commercial subsidiary of CASIC, and it's a local Wuhan company, and they're very, very rich company in the sense that they've raised a lot of money, and they launch a lot of rockets for customers. And of all the commercial launch companies, they're the biggest by far. And again, they're the local Wuhan host at this dinner. And we get to this restaurant, and it's this big circular table with like 30 seats. And at the table is Xspace, and then like 4 other commercial launch companies all have their representatives. And this felt like a scene out of a mafia movie where it's all the mafia families that are meeting for the summit. But it was just this big dinner that was hosted by Xspace. And because Xspace was the big state-owned incumbent, they were the ones paying, and all the commercial companies could just kind of be there that evening on Xspace, and that was just, it's a very, and I think it seems like to that point, these commercial companies, the mindset is almost like, if any one of us survives, that's good for all of us, and so we all stick together, and yes, we compete for the market, but we all remain friends because eventually there's probably only going to be 1 or 2 of us. And we better sort of collaborate. So yeah, it's a very different. I don't think that I've ever seen such a similar dinner at a Western conference, but maybe I have not been to too many. So yeah.
And maybe to build up on that point, on the fact that these private companies and these state-owned companies have this sort of cooperation, but also competition relationship that is quite uneasy for a lot of those private companies, because on a very large scale, those many subsidiaries of state-owned companies are actually directly competing with the activities of these new private startups. And so there's a definite overlapping in many applications. And yet when you ask, when in many interviews, when these space startup founders get asked, what role do these state-owned companies have? Are they overlapping on your activity? How is this going to, how are you going to coordinate all this in the future? And what future is there for your company if a huge, state-owned enterprise that is extremely well funded is also, offering products on your specific vertical? And their answer is often, oh, this is, a win-win cooperation. We aren't direct competitors. We just fill gaps. There's never direct opposition or criticism of the sometimes unsupportive way that some space-owned enterprises and subsidiaries have towards these private startups. So yeah, that's also a very interesting point.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a very good point. You don't get a lot of direct criticism of that. It's interesting.
And maybe I see that we've reached more or less the 45-minute-ish mark. Maybe to wrap this podcast up, maybe Blaine and I were just going to give a quick discussion of why we find this industry fascinating. So beyond these similarities and differences, and for me, one of the main things that I like about the Chinese space industry, beyond my interest in space and in China, is the fact that things are moving extremely fast. There is always something new to talk about. I think Blaine, you and I, we perhaps have one call a week approximately, and we always have something to talk about. Maybe it's this local space startup in China raising 50 to 100 million RMB. Perhaps it's the latest launch. Many announcements that happen over every month. So I think that's what I like about Chinese space, and I guess that's also comparable to other sectors that you have in China, typically tech, where things are moving extremely fast.
That's a good one. So from my side, it's a large and opaque industry. So there's so many companies and bureaus and ministries and organizations and subsidiaries, and it's very unclear what the relationship is between all of these organizations. And I recently I've done a lot of research on specific elements of the Chinese space industry over these last couple of months, and the number of new companies that I keep finding, and new subsidiaries of state-owned companies, and new, a lot of people. I don't even think we talked today at all about the Chinese Academy of Sciences, for example, because they're a totally different thing from CASC and CASIC and the CNSA. But they're a really big organization themselves with 60,000 academics and a bunch of commercial spin-offs, one of which Lenovo is probably you've heard of. They're a really interesting one. So yeah, huge and opaque, and it means that you are always discovering something new, because it's just a huge opaque industry. It's really interesting.
For me personally, it gives this explorer feeling. Like you're always, it's the opacity makes you always, have to dig for information in various, resources that are available only in Chinese. So I guess that's definitely an obstacle and a challenge, but also that's part of, I guess, the fun of Chinese space. And for me, perhaps the last one would be the importance of the Chinese space program, because, well, as we all know, China is a rising international power, and space is closely linked to international politics, and that is also something I'm quite interested in. And so it will be interesting to see how space has a role to play in international politics in the future, and how things evolve down the road.
And just to kind of add to that, this importance of the Chinese space program, I think one thing, taking a sort of different angle that strikes me, is the importance of the Chinese space program within China. And I just remember my first conference I ever went to in the Chinese, in my first space conference I went to in China. It was about 3 years ago in Beijing. And I remember they had a camera, like a video, a camera broadcasting this live online, and then they had a big kind of projector screen with questions streaming in from people that were watching this conference live online. And just the extent to which space in China is just a really popular, hot thing right now. I mean, I was shocked that I was at this conference in Beijing. It was a very dry conference, a lot of traditional space industry people that were just talking about rather traditional space industry things, and you had fans online asking them questions over on this platform. And just another example is the rocket that's sold on April Fool's Day online that got 500 million views, because space is just a really hot topic in China, and I think that's just really, it's interesting. It makes me feel a little bit like what it may have felt like to be in the U.S. in the 1960s during the space race. This very society kind of coming together and getting excited about the country's space program. And I think it's really, it's good to see the following of space in China. And hopefully, shameless plug, we can get some of the following in space in China to come and join us on the Dongfang Hour as fans. I know it's an English language podcast, but we are always happy to hear from Chinese language fans as well. And yeah, I think that's my last thing that I love about the industry. Yeah, the fans.
Absolutely.
Love the fans.
Okay. So we're about at the 50 minutes, 1 hour mark. We are going to stop here. So in any case, if to our listeners, if you've enjoyed this podcast, feel free to give us a like, to follow our channel, and of course, if you have any questions or any comments about what we said, or you'd like to know more, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below. And as well as if you have any direct questions for us, you can also email us at our email, which is dfhour@gmail.com. So dfhour@gmail.com.